Winter has bitten deep. In 1788, frost arrives early and stays late. Rivers ice over, roads clog and grain carts stall. By spring 1789, hunger shadows the countryside. Bread, the daily staple, soars beyond what many can pay. Families sell tools, then furniture, then hope. A kingdom that fed Europe now struggles to feed itself. France is not only cold, it is broke. Years of royal debt, swelled by costly wars, including support for the American Revolution, crush the treasury. Reformers propose new taxes on privilege. Powerful courts and nobles refuse. The king's ministers come and go. None can square the books or calm the streets. Sparks appear before the blaze. In 1775, grain riots, the Flour War, erupt around Paris, warning what hunger can unleash. In June 1788, Grenoble's Day of the Tiles sees townspeople hurl roof tiles at royal troops, one of the first pitched clashes between citizens and the crown. The message is clear: pressure is building. On 24 January 1789, Louis XVI issues the call. The Estates General will meet for the first time since 1614. Three orders, clergy, nobility, and the vast Third Estate, will gather to confront the crisis. When the doors open at Versailles on 5 May 1789, expectations are enormous, trust is thin, and Paris listens for the first tremor of change. This is not yet a republic or a manifesto or a march. It is a question hanging in the air of crowded halls and empty granaries. What happens when a kingdom forgets its people, and the people learn they can speak? Tonight we will walk quietly, carefully, through the opening chapters of the French Revolution, using only established facts and dates accepted by historians. No myths, no melodrama. Just the human truth of a society at its breaking point, and the ideas that would reshape the modern world. If you value calm, well-sourced history that helps you sleep a little wiser. Tap subscribe, like this episode, and share it with someone who loves thoughtful storytelling. When you're ready, breathe in, settle back, and let's begin. Before the first stones of the Bastille are loosened, France is already an intricate machine, beautiful in design, uneven in motion, and grinding loudly in 1789. Historians call it the Ancient Regime, the old order that governed the kingdom until the revolution shattered it. Society is formally divided into three estates: clergy, nobility, and everyone else, the Third Estate. Political rights and social status flow from one's estate and province, not from a single national citizenship in the modern sense. The First Estate, the clergy, ranges from powerful bishops to humble parish priests. The church owns significant land and collects the tithe, the dime, traditionally about a tenth on certain agricultural income, feeding its charities, schools, and ecclesiastical administration. In return, the clergy often negotiates a free gift to the crown rather than paying direct royal taxes. The church's reach is spiritual and practical. It registers births, marriages, and deaths, and shapes daily rhythms of village life. The Second Estate, the nobility, includes both grand seigneurs anchored by lineage and the nobles of the robe, who have purchased or inherited judicial and administrative offices. While nobles are far from uniformly rich, as a legal order they enjoy exemption from many direct taxes and claim precedence in the upper ranks of the army and the church. In the 1780s, those upper ranks become even more aristocratic preserves, one of the sharpest points of friction with ambitious commoners. The Third Estate is vast and varied: peasants and sharecroppers who work the land, urban laborers, skilled artisans within city guilds, and a growing bourgeoisie of merchants, lawyers, officials, and professionals. Some Third Estate families are prosperous and literate. Millions more live close to subsistence. What unites them is not wealth or occupation, but their legal status as the non-privileged, those who, more than any others, bear the weight of taxation. Taxes under the old regime are complicated and deeply resented. The direct land tax, the taille, falls overwhelmingly on the Third Estate. Nobles and clergy are largely exempt by law or privilege. Indirect taxes bite too: customs duties, excises on wine and goods. And above all, the gabelle, the notorious salt tax, whose uneven rates and mandatory purchase rules make it one of the most hated impositions in France. Smuggling proliferates, and the grievance appears prominently in 1789. Obligations are not only monetary. The corvée, unpaid labor for public works, most famously road building, requires days of service from peasants when money is scarce and time in the fields is precious. In many regions, seigneurial dues persist, payments or in-kind services owed to the local lord, along with fees for using ovens, mills, or presses, banalités. These are embedded, layered, and felt unevenly across the countryside, but together they symbolize a world in which hierarchy is written into everyday life. If Paris is the kingdom stage, the provinces are its engine. France is divided into administrative districts called généralités, each overseen by an intendant, a royal official charged with implementing crown policy, supervising taxation, policing, and justice. The intendants, developed in the 17th century, are the backbone of centralization. They link Versailles to distant villages, often to the irritation of local elites who see their traditional authority narrowed. Yet royal authority is not absolute in practice. Powerful sovereign courts called parlements, especially the Parlement of Paris, register royal edicts before they become law and can issue remonstrances, formal objections that delay or pressure the crown. When the Paris magistrates resist sweeping financial reforms in 1771, Chancellor Maupeou dissolves and restructures the courts by force, when Louis XVI dies in 1774. The young Louis XVI restores the parlements, and with them a formidable brake on change. This pendulum swing makes later fiscal repair far harder. Money, like law, exposes the system's seams. To fund war and court, kings have long sold offices, venality, expanding a class of office holders who often gain noble status over generations. Venal offices finance the state, but entrench privileges and complicate reform. Any attempt to rationalize administration means threatening the investments and identities of thousands of families. It is a slow-working trap. A fiscal fix in one century becomes a political minefield in the next. In towns, guilds regulate entry to trades, apprenticeship, quality, and prices. Defenders say guilds protect standards and consumers. Critics argue they restrict competition and mobility. For an urban craftsman, the guild is community and protection. For an upstart entrepreneur, it can be a locked door. Here again, structures built to stabilize economic life can, in times of stress, feel like walls. Daily life under the old regime is not static or universally grim. The 18th century brings periods of commercial growth, new crops, improvements in roads, and an expanding print culture. The crown sponsors road building and navigational projects. Merchants knit provincial markets together. But the same century also magnifies inequalities, and when harvests fail, as in 1788, food prices spike rapidly across an interlinked economy, straining urban and rural households alike. The crisis that follows is economic, social, and political at once. The crown's fiscal structure creaks under the weight of war debts and uneven revenue. Support for the American Revolution in the late 1770s wins France geopolitical satisfaction, but adds significantly to costs. Ministers propose rationalizing taxes, broadening the base and trimming privileges. Court politics, institutional resistance, and fear of vested interests stall or dilute these plans. By the late 1780s, reformers across estates agree that something must change. Only the content and cost of that change divides them. Legally, the estate's structure is precise. Socially, it is porous. Noble titles can be acquired over time via office holding. Wealthy commoners purchase posts for status and security. Poor nobles seek military commissions to maintain standing. Meanwhile, many parish priests, though legally first estate, live modestly and sympathize with third estate concerns, especially in rural parishes where they witness peasant burdens firsthand. The law fixes a state identity, lived experience blurs it. Justice itself depends on overlapping jurisdictions, customary laws in the north, Roman-influenced written law in much of the south, seigneurial courts in the countryside, and royal bailliages and praesidiaux above them, culminating in the parlements. The result is not lawlessness but complexity. Litigants and officials navigate a maze. Attempts to streamline, like Maupeou's, provoke strong backlash, not only because they threaten privileges, but because they challenge how authority has long been balanced among crown courts and corporate bodies. For the peasant majority, what matters is the balance between what the land yields and what obligations take away. In good years, communities shoulder dues and taxes. In lean years, the system feels predatory. The tithe to the church, the landlord's dues, the royal taxes, and the corvée together can turn a bad harvest into a desperate season. Anger tends to fix on immediate agents, the tax farmer, the seigneur's steward, the salt official, rather than on abstract institutions. When fear and rumor mix with hunger, uprisings can flash across the countryside. The political nation, meanwhile, has no single representative body that meets regularly. The Estates General, France's traditional assembly of the three orders, has not gathered since 1614. In its long absence, parliaments claim to speak for the fundamental laws and to guard liberties against ministerial overreach. This is not democracy. It is a conservative break that often defends privilege while also checking abrupt royal experiments. By recalling the parliaments in 1774, Louis XVI restores a counterweight that he soon finds he cannot move. Encyclopedia Britannica +1, yet the old regime is not merely a museum of old privileges. It is also a busy workshop of state building. Intendants circulate orders, roads stretch across provinces, ports hum with Atlantic trade, and the crown experiments with reforms, sometimes tentative, sometimes bold. The paradox is stark. A system designed for order contains within it the instruments to change that order, but every reform threatens someone's chartered right. What is rational in a ledger can be revolutionary in a village. In early 1789, with bankruptcy looming and unrest rising, Louis XVI summons the Estates General. The election process allows broad male participation by the standards of the time, and across parishes, towns, and bailliages. Voters compile cahiers de doléances, grievance lists that reveal an astonishing portrait of hope and frustration, fairer taxation, access to offices by merit, local justice, cheaper salt. Regular assemblies. The very act of writing and collecting grievances teaches people to speak politically in their own names. Taken together, these features, the estate's legal hierarchy, tax exemptions and indirect burdens, corvée and seigneurial dues, the tangled courts and powerful parliaments, venality of office, guild regulation, and the centralized reach of intendants compose the world before the storm. It is not a caricature of pure oppression, nor a free and open society awaiting only a nudge. It is a negotiated order, long-standing and deeply rooted, that delivers stability for some and immobility for many. When harvests fail and credit dries up, the equilibrium breaks. Understanding this old regime matters because it explains why 1789 becomes a revolution, not just a reform. When delegates of the Third Estate arrive at Versailles, they do not come as blank slates. They carry centuries of layered obligations, punctured by flashes of royal centralization and judicial resistance, shaped by a church both intimate and powerful, and hardened by the lived arithmetic of bread, dues, and taxes. Only by seeing this full mosaic can we grasp why the first decisions in May and June 1789, about voting, verification of powers, and common deliberation, ignite a chain reaction. As we leave this chapter, hold the image of three doors standing side by side, the sacristy, the manor hall, and the marketplace. In 1789 France, most people walk through the third door every day. What happens next begins when they decide that, despite tradition, precedent, and fear, they too are the nation. In the next part, we will watch the Third Estate act on that conviction. Before crowds assemble in Paris, the revolution first unfolds on the page. Across the 18th century, writers argue that power must serve reason, rights, and the common good. Later generations call this the Enlightenment. It does not prescribe one blueprint, it opens a debate. What makes law legitimate, authority limited, and citizens free? In France, those questions sharpen into a challenge to the old regime itself. One of the most influential voices is Charles Louis II at Montesquieu, whose The Spirit of the Laws, 1748, studies how institutions shape liberty. He classifies forms of government and advances a durable idea. Separating legislative, executive, and judicial powers helps guard freedom by preventing any single body from ruling unchecked. His analysis, inspired partly by his reading of the English Constitution, spreads widely and later influences constitutional framers on both sides of the Atlantic. In pre-revolutionary France, it offers language to resist arbitrary power without rejecting government altogether. Jean-Jacques Rousseau pushes the question of legitimacy to its core. In The Social Contract, 1762, He argues that laws are just only when they express the general will, the common interest formed by citizens who together are sovereign. Obedience to such laws is not submission to a ruler but fidelity to a community one helps constitute. This is a rigorous ideal, debated then and now, yet its central claim, that sovereignty ultimately rests with the nation, will echo through 1789. If Montesquieu arms reformers with a framework and Rousseau supplies a language of popular sovereignty, Denis Diderot and his collaborators build the circulating library of modernity. The Encyclopédie, first volumes 1751-1765, ultimately 35 volumes, seeks not merely to store knowledge but to change how people think, arranging crafts, sciences, and critiques in a single, searchable world of print. Even when censored or placed on church indexes, it continues to spread through reprints and private libraries, nurturing habits of inquiry and skepticism. Enlightenment ideas travel not only in books but across tables and voices. Paris salons, many hosted by influential women such as Madame Geoffrin, bring together nobles, writers, scientists, and officials to argue literature, philosophy, and politics. These gatherings do not elect assemblies, but they train a public to weigh arguments and judge power by reasons rather than rank. In this sociable crucible, critique becomes a polite, and sometimes impolite, habit. None of this occurs in a vacuum. Royal censorship licenses presses and can ban books. The crown wields letters de cachet to silence or confine critics. Yet print finds corridors, foreign editions, clandestine shipments, and coded satire slip past walls. The result is a paradox familiar to historians. Attempts to control opinion inadvertently advertise its importance. Even where prosecution is rare, the possibility of suppression underscores the stakes of speech and sharpens demands for lawful limits on authority. Voltaire François-Marie Arouet fights for tolerance and against arbitrary persecution. His campaigns in notorious cases, like the rehabilitation of Jean Collas, popularized the argument that justice must be transparent and proportionate. While Voltaire is often skeptical of democracy, his relentless assault on fanaticism and abuses of power widens the moral ground on which critics of privilege stand. Enlightenment is less a party line than a toolbox. Voltaire supplies some of its sharpest instruments. Economic thinkers add more tools. The physiocrats argue that agriculture underpins national wealth and call for simpler, more uniform taxation and freer trade in grain, ideas that collide with entrenched privileges and regulations. Whether or not ordinary peasants read Quesnay, their experience with dues, tolls, and the salt tax makes them keen judges of any reform that promises fairness in food. The Enlightenment is thus not just a philosophy of salons, but a pressure for administrative clarity and predictable law. By the late 1780s, a generation raised on these debates confronts crisis. When the king summons the Estates General for May 1789, the political nation begins writing cahiers de doléances, grievance lists that speak in a new tone, abolish privileges that violate equality. Ensure taxation falls by capacity to pay, open offices by merit, and allow regular representation. The words rights, nation, and representation carry fresh weight because a century of argument has prepared them. In that ferment appears a short, combustible pamphlet, Abbé Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes' What is the Third Estate? Written in the last months of 1788 and published at the start of 1789, it distills Enlightenment premises into political thunder. The Third Estate, Sieyes writes, is everything. It labors, trades, thinks, and sustains the nation. If the privileged orders claim separate corporate rights that block the common good, they must yield to the sovereign nation, counted by head, not by estate. The argument does not merely ask for kindness toward commoners, it relocates sovereignty from orders to the nation's people. The point is not that a few books caused a revolution. Hunger, debt, and political stalemate supply combustible material. But Enlightenment writing provides tinder and a map. Rulers are accountable because law should be rational. Individuals possess rights because they are human. Not because they belong to a privileged body. Power should be divided to protect liberty, and the nation, not a dynasty, is the source of sovereignty. In 1789, these sentences stop being theory and begin to become rules. We can watch this translation from paper to politics in August 1789, when the National Assembly adopts the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Its opening articles state that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, that political association aims to preserve liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, and that the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. These are Enlightenment claims, legislated in the heat of crisis. Montesquieu's caution about concentrated power also leaves fingerprints on 1789's debates and beyond. While France's early revolutionary governments struggle to realize clean separations, the ideal avoid unchecked authority by distributing functions becomes a lasting standard by which constitutions are judged, including in the new United States. The transatlantic echo reminds us, ideas migrate, adapt, and return with new force. Rousseau's legacy is complex. His language of the general will inspires demands for equality before law and for participation in making it. It also tempts some leaders to claim that they, and they alone, voice the people's will. The revolution will wrestle with this tension between inclusive sovereignty and the danger of speaking for it. But in 1789, the liberating thrust is clear. Laws must rest on the consent and common good of citizens, not on inherited corporate privilege. Diderot's project, for its part, demonstrates why the printed page becomes a political force. An encyclopedia that catalogs techniques and trades elevates the dignity of work. Entries that analyze government or religion invite readers to compare arguments rather than accept decrees. Even where expensive or restricted, compendia, pamphlets, and periodicals create a habit. Consult evidence, weigh claims, and then decide. That civic habit prepares voters in 1789 to draft grievances and to send delegates who will assert themselves as a national assembly. Salons form the bridge between private reading and public action. In these rooms, conversation disciplines disagreement, rank can be challenged by wit, and reputations rise or fall by the strength of ideas. Women who host and curate such spaces exercise real cultural authority, shaping agendas and networks that feed into journalism, academia, and politics. When opinion later becomes the lifeblood of revolutionary Paris, it draws from this earlier apprenticeship in argument. Censorship's shadows, finally, give Enlightenment ideals their urgency. The existence of banned books, confiscated pamphlets, and royal orders that silence dissent makes the case for rules that bind rulers. By 1789, even moderates accept that France needs more than benevolent intentions. It needs guarantees, rights stated, procedures fixed, powers defined. The shift from good government to limited government by design is an Enlightenment inheritance. When delegates arrive at Versailles, they carry more than local complaints. They carry a century of arguments about law, rights, and sovereignty, arguments now forced into practice by hunger, debt, and political stalemate. Enlightenment thought does not dictate the revolution's path, it sets its terms. In the next chapter, bread prices and budgets will collide with these ideas, turning philosophy into events. Long before cannon fire and barricades, France's revolution begins with arithmetic. By the late 1780s, the monarchy's finances are a tangle of old privileges and new debts. War has been expensive, taxation uneven, administration complex. When harvests fail and credit dries up, numbers turn political, and the kingdom's balance sheet becomes its most dangerous pamphlet. Start with debt. In the 1770s and early 1780s, the crown borrows heavily to fund fleets, armies, and diplomacy, most dramatically to support the American War of Independence. Borrowing is not new, but the scale and structure are perilous. Much of it is short-term, floating debt, constantly rolled over. When confidence falters, refinancing stalls. Periodically, the state consolidates this floating debt into longer maturities, painful admissions that cash has run out. By the late 1780s, lenders demand clarity and reform that the political system struggles to deliver. Jack Necker, finance minister from 1776 to 1781, plays an unintended role. In February 1781, he publishes the Compte Rendu au Roi, a path-breaking, highly popular public report claiming a surplus on the ordinary budget. But the headline excludes the extraordinary wartime accounts where the true costs sit. The report lifts Necker's prestige and helps the state borrow more, yet it also breeds skepticism later, when successors warn that the cupboard is bare. France's credit, bolstered by optimism, will sour when reality intrudes. After Necker's departure, Charles Alexander de Calonne, 1783–1787, confronts worsening deficits. His diagnosis: the system is structurally unfair and fiscally ineffective. His cure: a general land tax without privilege, the subvention territoriale, provincial assemblies, freer grain trade, and administrative simplification. To sell this, Louis XVI convenes an elite body, the Assembly of Notables, on 22 February 1787, the first such meeting since Louis XIV's era. Calonne expects endorsement. He meets resistance. Many notables distrust his numbers and fear the implications of taxing privilege. Calonne is dismissed in April 1787. The crisis is now public, political, and urgent. Calonne's successor, Archbishop Etienne Charles de Lamini de Brienne, tries a different route: new loans and modified reforms, and crucially, pressuring the high courts, parlements, to register fiscal edicts. The parlements, defenders of fundamental laws, refuse or stall. The confrontation escalates through 1787–1788. Remonstrances, exiles, and royal countermoves culminate in the May Edicts of 1788, which curb parliamentary power. The backlash is immediate. In Grenoble on 7 June 1788, townspeople hurl roof tiles at royal troops, the day of the tiles, an early urban warning of national unrest. Then nature strikes. The 1788 harvest is poor. In July, violent hailstorms flatten fields across swaths of France. The winter of 1788–89 is among the harshest in memory. Rivers freeze, mills stop, roads clog, and fuel costs soar. Grain supplies tighten. Bread prices surge through late 1788 and into 1789, consuming household budgets and starving local markets of any spending beyond food. Hunger radicalizes grievance. Misery makes rumor fast. As revenues sag and borrowing costs rise, the monarchy, still paying interest on yesterday's wars, runs out of road. On 16 August 1788, the government effectively suspends payments on parts of its debt, a de facto bankruptcy that shatters what credit remains. A week later, Brienne resigns. Necker returns to office amid street celebrations, a symbol of hope for lenders and the public alike. But no minister can conjure food, erase arrears, or legislate consent. The problem is not only numbers, it is authority. Why was reform so difficult? Because fiscal rationality collided with entrenched rights. Under the old regime, estates, corporations, provinces, and office holders defend special exemptions and jurisdictions. Direct taxes like the taille fall mainly on the third estate. Indirect imposts like the salt tax, gabelle, and internal tolls vex trade and consumers. Tax farming contracts, in which private firms advance money to the crown and collect certain taxes, blur lines between public need and private profit. To modernize is to threaten established bargains, often backed by law and court. Reformers can count in ledgers, opponents count votes in bodies that must register edicts. And the hungry count loaves. The crown also bears the cost of its own past solutions. Selling offices has financed the state for generations, but venal office holders expect return and status. Streamlining administration means devaluing investments. Provincial privileges promise local consent. Centralization breeds efficiency, but invites accusations of despotism. In other words, every fiscal lever is attached to a social nerve. Pull too hard and the body politic jerks. Economics and opinion feed each other. The Comte Rendu taught the public to expect transparency. The flood of pamphlets in 1787–1789, many attacking privilege or defending corporate rights, turned finances into a national conversation. Merchants, artisans, and peasants may not parse balance sheets, but they all feel bread at 2 sous and then 3. They see tax collectors at the door. They hear that some pay little while others pay much. The fiscal crisis becomes a moral crisis. Who pays and by what right? Consider sequence. February, May 1787, the Assembly of Notables debates and balks at Calonne's plan. Mid-1787 to mid-1788, Brienne wrangles with parliaments, tries to push loans and edicts, and meets revolt on the streets and in provincial elites. Summer 1788, harvest failure and hail, August 16, suspension of payments, August 25, Necker's recall. Autumn 1788, With the state's credit still fragile, the court concedes what critics demand: a national assembly to sanction new taxes and broader reforms. On 24 January 1789, the royal edict summons the Estates General for May. Finance has forced open the political door. How did empty treasuries translate into crowded streets? When bread takes 90% of a laborer's wage, any price movement is existential. As grain dearer, demand for non-essentials collapses, workshops dismiss hands, unemployment rises, the urban poor, newly idle, join queues and crowds. Meanwhile, rural producers facing dues and taxes hoard or delay sales, fearing worse scarcity, tightening supplies further. Each rumor of a hidden granary, each convoy delayed by ice or banditry, becomes a spark. At the top, ministers confront hard choices. Raise new taxes without reform, and you inflame injustice. Reform exemptions, and you trigger elite vetoes. Borrow more, and you deepen the hole. Cut military or court spending, and you shake prestige and patronage networks that help govern the realm. Calon's broad-based land tax would have aligned burdens with capacity to pay, but required consent from those who benefited from the old order. Brienne's struggle with the parlements shows the trap. Institutions designed to check arbitrary power now block necessary change. The result is stalemate until insolvency ends the debate by force of fact. The Estates General, when finally summoned, is not merely a fiscal committee. Across France, communities draft cahiers de doléances, grievance lists that unite the kitchen table with the state ledger: fairer taxes, abolition of tax farming, end of feudal dues. Regular representation, equal access to offices, freedom for the grain trade, uniform laws. The crisis has educated a nation. People who yesterday petitioned a seigneur now write, vote, and send deputies. Finance has minted citizens. One cannot reduce the revolution to bankruptcy alone. There were long-standing tensions between centralized absolutism and local rights, between noble status and bourgeois wealth, between church privilege and calls for equality, between a growing public sphere and an old regime wary of opinion. But 1788-1789 compresses these tensions. The treasury fails at the moment, hunger surges and courts resist. A shock in the harvest meets a shock in credit, meets a shock in legitimacy. To grasp the intensity, imagine Paris in early 1789. River ice slows flour mills, carts arrive late, bakers ration loaves, crowds grow outside shops before dawn. Pamphlets, tens of thousands, circulate, asking why a nation rich in land and people is poor in bread and cash. Stories of ministerial blunders mingle with detailed proposals for taxes, without privilege and assemblies by head. The language of accounts and rights merges. Who pays becomes who decides. The monarchy's last gambit is hope that the Estates General will authorize new revenue and heal divisions. But the very act of convening it breaks a taboo. Sovereignty, long embodied in king and court, now visibly requires the nation's voice. From the opening on 5 May 1789, disputes about procedure, vote by estate or by head, verify powers separately or together, become contests over who owns the crisis and who may cure it. The Third Estate, carrying both the heaviest taxes and the sharpest new political skills, will not be sidelined. Finance has lit a constitutional fuse. Summarize the mechanism: chronic deficits plus war finance, debt, right arrow reform proposals that strike privilege, right arrow institutional veto, parliaments, notables, right arrow market shock, harvest failure. Frozen transport, right arrow price spiral and unemployment, right arrow suspension of payments, loss of credit, right arrow compelled recourse to national representation. Each arrow is documented. Together they form the chain that drags France from fiscal emergency to political revolution. History often turns when abstract systems, credit, taxation, courts, crash into daily life. In 1788-1789, they crash all at once. The numbers on the page, deficits, arrears, rates, become lines in bread queues and slogans in crowds. Ministers come and go, plans bloom and wither, the weather itself seems to judge. The old regime has no reserve of coin, of grain, or of trust. Bankruptcy is therefore not only fiscal, it is social. In the next part, events accelerate. The Estates General assembles. The Third Estate steps beyond petition into action, and Paris watches a constitutional argument become a movement. Before the storm breaks over a prison, it sweeps first through ledgers, courts, and councils, proof that revolutions, like economies, begin with confidence and end when it disappears. When Louis XVI summons the Estates General, he exhumes an institution that has not met since 1614. The decision, announced by royal edict on 24 January 1789, is not a gesture of confidence, but a concession to crisis. France needs money, legitimacy, and unity. The king hopes a national assembly of the three estates, clergy, nobility, and the third estate, can supply all three. Instead, the body will expose how little consensus remains. The road to Versailles runs through a year of failed reforms, poor harvests, and a shattered credit market. Under mounting pressure, the crown tries to shape the coming meeting. In December 1788, the Royal Council grants the doubling of the third, allowing the third estate to elect as many deputies as the clergy and nobility combined. On paper, this looks like a breakthrough. In practice, the key question, will votes be counted by estate or by head, each deputy one vote, is left unsettled. A doubled third without voting by head is still outvoted 2-1. Elections unfold through the winter of 1788-1789. Across parishes, towns, and bailliages, men eligible under the rules gather to choose representatives and, crucially, to draft cahiers de doléances, notebooks of grievances. The texts vary by place and estate, but certain themes repeat: equality before taxation, abolition of feudal dues that no longer match their original purposes, regular national representation, freedom of the grain trade, and judicial reform. The process is as important as the content. In writing grievances and electing deputies, communities practice politics in their own names. Louis XVI and his ministers aim to channel this energy, not unleash it. The king prefers the Estates General to deliberate separately by order, as precedent dictates, and to produce consent for new taxes and a program of administrative rationalization. Many nobles and clergy agree, but in the third estate, especially among lawyers, office holders, and men of the robe, the very idea of the nation is changing. They carry to Versailles not only local complaints, but Enlightenment arguments about sovereignty residing in the nation rather than in corporate privilege. Versailles in early May 1789 is a study in contrasts. On 4 May, the traditional religious procession and mass mark the solemn opening. Deputies from the clergy appear in white, nobles glitter in silk and lace, and the deputies of the third estate wear plain black coats with short capes. The visual hierarchy of the old regime is on display. The political hierarchy is about to be contested. The formal opening session on 5 May, held in the Menus Plaisirs Hall, begins with speeches. Finance Minister Jacques Necker offers a long, statistical address outlining France's fiscal needs and hinting at reforms. It is serious and dry, less a trumpet call than a ledger read aloud. The first order of business is procedural, verifying the deputies' credentials. Should each estate verify separately, as tradition holds, or should all deputies verify together, as the third estate urges, symbolizing a single national body? The king's officials press for separate verification. The third estate refuses. Days stretch into weeks of stalemate. Meanwhile, public interest swells in nearby Paris, where pamphlets report every turn and crowds debate the meaning of each delay. Personalities begin to matter. Among the third estate, figures like Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, author of What is the Third Estate, and the fiery Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Muribau, push hard for joint verification and voting by head. Among the clergy, many parish priests, the lower clergy with modest means and close ties to villages, are more sympathetic to the third estate than their bishops are. In the nobility, a minority of liberal nobles advocate compromise but face pressure from conservative peers. The chambers harden around principle and pride. The third estate makes a decisive move. On 10 June, after fruitless invitations for the other orders to join in common verification, the deputies of the third begin verifying credentials on their own. Some parish priests cross the line and join them. On 17 June 1789, convinced that legitimacy rests in representing the greatest number and the taxpayers of the nation, the assembled deputies declare themselves the National Assembly. It is a constitutional thunderclap. They claim authority to legislate on matters of taxation and reform because they embody the nation. The king hesitates, consults, and considers reasserting control. Court politics swarm, some urge conciliation, others a firm hand. The hall assigned to the Third Estate is suddenly closed on 20 June, officially for preparations for a royal session. The deputies decamp to a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they take a collective oath not to separate until they have given France a constitution. The tennis court oath becomes the moral center of the early revolution, a promise that politics will not end with fiscal repair, but continue until the fundamental rules of power are written. Louis XVI prepares a séance royale, a royal session, for 23 June. He plans to annul the Assembly's recent votes, order the estates back to separate chambers, and outline a royal program of limited reform, equality in taxation, some feudal relief. Press moderation, reforms meaningful on paper, but leaving initiative with the crown. On the day the king enters with ceremony, speaks firmly but not ferociously, and then departs. The symbolism is clear. The monarch has spoken. The meeting is over. What follows is unexpected at court, but consistent with the new mood. When a royal usher reminds the deputies to withdraw, they do not move. Mirabeau's defiant response, later printed in stirring paraphrases, captures the essence if not the exact words of the moment. The deputies will not depart at a command that lacks legal force. They act in the nation's name. The president of the Assembly, astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, maintains the session. The deputies vote to reaffirm their earlier measures. Authority is no longer a one-way conversation. Pressure mounts on all sides. In the days after the royal session, more clergy, joined by a handful of nobles, cross over to the National Assembly. Crowds in Paris cheer the news. Pamphleteers celebrate. The king faces a choice: attempt to dissolve the assembly by force, which risks urban violence and a broader rebellion, or yield to the fact of national representation and try to steer it. On 27 June 1789, Louis XVI orders the remaining clergy and nobles to join the National Assembly. The three orders are now one chamber by royal command, but notably on terms the Third Estate set. This moment does not transform Louis XVI into a constitutional monarch overnight, nor does it erase tensions among deputies. But it marks a hinge. Sovereignty, once embodied in the king alone, now appears in a representative body claiming to speak for the nation. The king's authority is not abolished. It is bounded by a new actor with its own momentum and legitimacy. The meeting he convened to repair finances has become a forum to redefine power. Outside the halls, the atmosphere grows taut. Royal troops gather near Paris and Versailles, officially to keep order. Parisians watch the troop movements with alarm. Memories of shortages and unrest are fresh. The price of bread remains high. Unemployment bites. Rumor accelerates. On 11 July, the dismissal of Necker will touch off events in the capital, but that turn belongs to the next chapter. For now, the pressure is already evident. The Estates General has transformed, and with it the stakes of every royal decision. How did Louis XVI arrive at this bind? Partly from structure, partly from temperament, and partly from timing. Structure: the old regime's institutions, parliaments, privileged orders, venal offices, made sweeping reform politically ruinous even when economically necessary. Temperament: the king was conscientious and pious, often indecisive, wary of confrontation, and slow to choose a single course amid divided counsel. Timing: when famine, debt, and an armed public sphere converged, the window for cautious reform closed. By summer 1789, every delay carried a price. It is tempting to read inevitability backward, but in early June, nothing is preordained. Different choices were possible: a firm early endorsement of voting by head, a royal embrace of joint verification, or a bold constitutional initiative from the crown might have guided events differently. Yet each option would have alienated powerful allies or required abandoning long-standing conceptions of monarchy. The crown tried to split the difference and lost initiative. For the deputies of the Third Estate, the fight over procedures was never mere formality. Verification together meant the nation exists as a single body. Voting by head meant the majority of representatives could actually legislate in that nation's name. The National Assembly's claim to tax, reform, and write a constitution therefore rests not on force, but on a particular reading of legitimacy. That authority flows from representation of the many. not from historical privilege of the few. For the clergy, divisions reflected social realities. Many bishops, tied to high office and wealth, favored estate voting and tradition. Many parish priests, closer to peasant burdens and village hopes, sided with the third. Their movement toward the assembly in June gave the new body moral weight. It said that conscience, not only calculation, was at work. For the nobles, the stakes were existential. Estate voting preserved a constitutional identity they believed anchored liberty against despotism. Conceding vote by head felt like surrendering the political role of a historic order. Some liberal nobles urged reform, but in the chamber the center of gravity stood with caution, until the royal order of 27 June made further resistance pointless. And for Louis XVI, each compromise seemed to erode the monarchy's ability to arbitrate. He sought to remain the source of change. The assembly insisted that the nation must be. The result was a duality of power, king and assembly, without yet a written constitution to define their boundaries. In that undefined space, fear thrived. Fear at court of anarchy, fear in Paris of a coup, and fear in the provinces that old obligations would be replaced by new uncertainties. The Estates General was summoned to steady the realm's finances. In the crucible of May and June 1789, it became the National Assembly, claiming the right to remake the realm itself. Louis XVI's crown did not fall. It tilted under the weight of a new principle. The next acts, troop movements, ministerial dismissals, and a fortress in Paris will show how rapidly ideas on parchment can become crowds in streets when a king is under pressure and a nation has found its voice. The Estates General opened in May 1789 to repair France's finances, but by mid-June it had become an argument about political legitimacy. The deputies of the Third Estate, joined by allies in the clergy, and soon a handful of nobles, faced a simple but explosive question: does the nation deliberate as three separate orders, or as one body representing the people? The answer would create a new institution. On 10 June, after weeks of procedural deadlock over verification of powers, the deputies of the Third invited the other orders to verify credentials in common. When the higher clergy and most nobles refused, the Third began verifying on its own. A trickle of parish priests, lower clergy closer to village life, crossed the aisle and joined them. The hall grew louder, not with shouting, but with the quiet scrape of chairs as the idea of the nation became a countable majority. The decisive stroke came on 17 June 1789. Convinced that sovereignty rests with those who represent the greatest number of taxpayers and citizens, the assembled deputies proclaimed themselves the National Assembly. They declared that all existing taxes were illegal unless authorized by the nation's representatives. Yet, to avoid administrative collapse, they allowed collection to continue temporarily under the Assembly's authority. They also affirmed the sacredness of the public debt, promising creditors that the nation, not the court, now guaranteed repayment. In one afternoon, fiscal arithmetic turned into constitutional principle. That same week revealed how fragile this new authority was. On the morning of 20 June, guards barred the deputies from their usual hall, officially for preparations for a royal session. The timing felt like a blow. Led by their president, the astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the deputies searched for a place large enough to hold them all and settled on a nearby indoor tennis court, the Jeu de Paume. There, standing beneath the angled rafters, they swore not to separate until they had given France a constitution. The tennis court oath made clear that their goal was no longer loans or minor adjustments. It was a written settlement of power. The oath's text, steered by Deputy Jean-Joseph Mounier, was deliberately broad: unity until a constitution, obedience only to lawful authority, and immediate readiness to meet wherever needed. It pledged perseverance rather than a detailed program, which is why it worked. Deputies of differing views, moderates seeking a constitutional monarchy, reformers looking to remake society, and cautious lawyers wary of haste, could all sign without betraying their consciences. The following day, 21 June, the assembly gathered in the parish church of St. Louis, a stone's throw from the palace. The pews filled with black-coated deputies and white-robed priests, a visual hint of the coalition forming. Work resumed, committees were created, correspondence organized, and draft measures prepared. The church became a workshop of legality, as if to answer anyone who claimed the assembly was merely a crowd. Louis XVI answered on 23 June with a séance royale, a royal session staged to reassert direction. He annulled recent votes of the assembly, ordered the estates to return to separate deliberations, and proposed a package of reforms from above: equal taxation, limited abolition of feudal burdens, freedom of the press within order, and periodic provincial assemblies. It was an offer of modernization without surrendering initiative. After speaking, the king departed with the ceremony of tradition, leaving behind a room full of deputies who now had to decide whether they recognized the command. What followed has been retold in ringing paraphrases, but the essential fact is plain: the assembly did not disperse. When a royal usher asked them to withdraw, President Bailey replied that the assembly could not adjourn except by its own will. Murraybow, already a commanding presence, added thunder of his own, insisting the deputies would not depart except at the point of bayonets. Whether or not those were his exact words, the vote that followed made the point in law. The assembly reaffirmed its earlier decrees and continued its session. Authority had become a negotiation, not an edict. Momentum shifted in the days that followed. On 24 June, significant numbers of the lower clergy joined the assembly en masse. On 25 June, 40-plus nobles, including the Duke of Orleans, crossed over as well. Each crossing was more than a tally. It was a symbol to the country that conscience, not only calculation, was at work. Villagers who respected their parish priest now saw that priest sitting with the nation. Courtiers who distrusted the third now saw nobles among them. The king faced an unattractive menu: enforce separation by force and risk civil disorder, negotiate from weakness, or accept the gathering fact of common deliberation and try to shape its outcome. On 27 June 1789, Louis XVI ordered the remaining clergy and nobles to join the National Assembly. In form, he united the orders. In substance, he acknowledged a reality created from below. The Estates General had become a single chamber, not because a king decreed it first, but because the nation insisted on it, and the king ratified the insistence. The new assembly's early work moved on two tracks: stabilizing the state and framing a constitution. On the stabilization side, deputies sought to keep revenue flowing, reassure creditors, quiet bread riots through administrative measures, and calm provinces nervous about sudden change. On the constitutional side, they debated first principles: where sovereignty resides in the nation, how powers should be separated, legislative, executive, judicial, the nature of the royal veto, suspensive or absolute, and the structure of representation, single chamber or two. The debates were technical and passionate in equal measure. Inside the hall, leaders emerged by competence rather than pedigree. Bailey brought procedural steadiness. Mounier provided constitutional draftsmanship. Pierre Victor Malouet argued for measured reform. Adrien Duport, Anton Barnave, and Alexander Lameth, the triumvirate, found their voices, and Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, spare and severe, kept returning the assembly to first principles. Even Murraybow, whose past scandals were common gossip, proved indispensable as a bridge between the court's need for order and the assembly's demand for authority grounded in the nation. Outside the hall, the country's anxieties surged. Troop concentrations around Paris and Versailles, officially to maintain order, fed rumors of a coming coup against the assembly. The price of bread remains high. Unemployment spread in the capital's workshops as demand for non-essentials collapsed. Pamphlets multiplied, newspapers sprouted, cafes became parliaments of the street. In this charged atmosphere, personnel changes took on the weight of destiny. The dismissal of Jacques Necker on 11 July would soon send Paris into motion, but that turn belongs to the next part of our story. One achievement of late June and early July is easy to miss because it is procedural. The assembly learned to work. It set up committees to gather data from ministries, required written drafts before votes, and demanded that decrees be framed with enforceable language. This mattered. By acting like a legislature rather than a rally, the assembly turned morale into law and gave provincial administrators something to implement rather than fear. Another achievement was psychological. By declaring itself national, swearing the tennis court oath, refusing to dissolve after the royal session, and receiving the king's order to join as one chamber, the assembly taught France a new grammar of politics. Sovereignty was no longer a person or a caste. It was a public thing, the res publica, represented by elected deputies who, at least in principle, spoke for all. That shift made later measures thinkable: the abolition of feudal dues, the declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen, the reorganization of provinces, and the subordination of the church to civil law. The calendar marked the transformation in a single line. On 9 July 1789, after weeks of asserting authority and sketching constitutional outlines, the deputies declared themselves the National Constituent Assembly. The new title announced their task plainly: to constitute, to give shape to the political order. From that day until the Constitution of 1791, their sessions would be an ongoing seminar in how to balance liberty with order, energy in government with safeguards against tyranny, and the voice of the capital with the needs of the countryside. It is tempting to see the assembly's birth as inevitable. It was not. If the clergy had stood wholly apart, if the nobles had remained solid, if the king had moved earlier to endorse voting by head, or if the deputies had fractured over the oath, the story might have bent elsewhere. What carried the day was a combination of principle and prudence. The deputies claimed sweeping authority, but promised continuity in tax collection. They spoke the language of rights but protected creditors. They defied the command to disperse, but invited the other orders to join. They moved fast enough to matter and carefully enough to reassure. From a distance of centuries, what stands out is the assembly's wager: that a nation could govern itself by rules written in daylight, that authority could be divided so it would not be abused, and that law could be both the product of reason and the guardian of daily bread. The wager was courageous, imperfect, and contested. It was also the beginning of modern politics in France. As we close this chapter, imagine the three scenes that made the assembly: the declarative vote of 17 June, the raised hands and crowded rafters of 20 June, and the quiet persistence of 23 June when the deputies refused to disperse. Together they formed a new center of gravity. In the next part, fear of force and hunger in Paris will collide with that center, and a stone fortress will fall, not because it is militarily decisive, but because a nation has decided that its representatives must be free. The fall of a stone fortress began with a shortage of powder. On the morning of 14 July 1789, Parisian crowds and mutinous soldiers broke into the Hôtel des Invalides and hauled away tens of thousands of muskets and several cannon, but little gunpowder. The rumor was clear: powder had been moved to the Bastille. With weapons but no charge, the city turned toward the medieval fortress prison that loomed over the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Why the Bastille? Not because it held many captives. By July 1789, only 7 prisoners were inside. But for decades, the Bastille had served as the visible instrument of royal authority in the capital, a place where letters de cachet once sent offenders to confinement without trial, and where munitions and gunpowder were stored under armed guard. It symbolized power that was both physical and discretionary. Its governor, Bernard-René Jourdan de Launay, born within its walls and appointed in 1776, commanded a small garrison. Around 80 veteran invalids and a reinforcement of roughly 30 Swiss grenadiers, with artillery mounted on the ramparts. The fortress was defensible, but it sat amid a dense neighborhood, and critically, negotiations would determine whether the guns would fire. By late morning on the 14th, a crowd gathered at the outer courtyard demanding 2 things: the withdrawal of cannon that seemed to threaten the streets, and the release of the fortress's powder and arms. Deputies from the Hôtel de Ville entered to negotiate. Time stretched, the crowd swelled, and patience thinned. Shortly after midday, the outer drawbridge chain was broken. The bridge crashed down, killing a man beneath it, and the besiegers surged forward. The balance between parley and panic tipped. Fire followed. From the towers and embrasures, defenders fired muskets and small cannon. From the streets and rooftops, attackers replied. Crucially, men of the Gardes Françaises, line infantry who had sided with the people, brought training and some artillery to the crowd. The fight was chaotic, not a formal siege. A few hours of smoke, ricochet, and shouted offers to stop the bloodshed if the garrison would simply hand over the powder and pull back the guns. Early accounts agree on the turning point: a white flag, a capitulation, the lowering of the inner drawbridge. The governor had sought guarantees of safe conduct for his men. The attackers, fearing delay or treachery, pressed their advantage. When the gates finally gave way, Paris poured in. The fortress fell by mid-afternoon. Contemporary estimates put the cost at roughly 98 attackers dead and one defender killed in the fight itself. Not long after, the day's fury turned lethal again. Delaunay was seized and dragged toward the Hôtel de Ville. Somewhere along the route, under blows and abuse, he cried that he preferred death. In the crush, he was killed and his head carried on a pike, a grim image that would haunt and define the day. The city official Jacques de Flesselles would also be slain amid accusations of duplicity. These killings were not ordered by any assembly. They were the crowd's justice in a city terrified of betrayal and invasion. Inside the Bastille, the outcome was more prosaic than legend. 7 prisoners emerged into the light. 4 forgers, an Irishman described as mentally ill, a man long confined for an attempt on Louis XV decades earlier, and a detained aristocrat. There were no iron masks and no packed dungeons. There were, however, full powder magazines and munitions, now in the hands of a city determined to defend its newly assertive National Assembly. The next day carried a second, quieter verdict: demolition. The Paris authorities commissioned Pierre-François Paul to dismantle the fortress. Stones became souvenirs and civic monuments. Models of the Bastille were carved from its very blocks and distributed across France as teaching objects of a new political faith. Where walls had menaced, rubble would testify. The political shock was immediate. In the days just before 14 July, troop concentrations and Necker's dismissal had convinced Parisians that a royal coup threatened the assembly. The fall of the Bastille reversed the current. Paris was now armed. The court stepped back. On 13 July, a bourgeois militia had been authorized to keep order. On 15 July, the Marquis de Lafayette, hero of the American War, was elected to lead it. And the militia soon took the name National Guard. The red-white-blue cockade, blending city colors with royal white, spread through hats and lapels. In the capital, a new municipal government, the Paris Commune, coalesced from the city's electors, signaling that authority would henceforth arise from civic bodies as well as from the palace. Across the provinces, news galloped. If Paris could humble a fortress, perhaps age-old dues and tolls could be challenged too. The great fear waves of panic, rumor, and rural uprising would follow within weeks, pushing the National Assembly toward abolishing feudal privileges in August. The chain of cause and effect is not mechanical, but the psychic threshold of 14 July is plain. The people had acted, and institutions yielded. What precisely made the Bastille decisive? Not military value alone. The fortress had limited strategic importance in 1789. Its power lay in symbol and logistics. It held gunpowder the city needed, and it represented the monarchy's right to coerce without consent. Capturing it armed Paris and disarmed a myth. It also fused 2 revolutions: the legal constitutional revolt at Versailles and the urban popular mobilization in the capital, into a single narrative that neither court nor assembly could ignore. Historical numbers, taken with care, support the scale and stakes. The Invalides yielded on the order of 30,000 muskets, the Bastille, 7 prisoners, the day's fighting, near 100 attackers dead. These are not the statistics of a grand battle, they are the ledger of a legitimacy crisis. When a fortress that once housed state prisoners is forced to surrender its powder to citizens, sovereignty has changed address. The anniversary would soon be recast as hope. On 14 July 1790, Paris staged the Fête de la Fédération on the Champ de Mars, a vast, choreographed celebration of national unity under a constitutional monarchy. Lafayette presided, Bishop Talleyrand celebrated Mass, the king swore an oath to the nation and the law. For a moment, the memory of violence served a promise of order and rights. That promise would totter in the years ahead, but the date would endure as France's national holiday. Look, finally, at the through line. The Estates General had opened a space for the nation to speak. The National Assembly had claimed authority to legislate. Paris now supplied the muscle to make that claim real. The storming of the Bastille did not end the revolution. It made it irreversible. Cannons rolled out, powder changed hands, a governor fell, and a city discovered its strength. From this day, any settlement in France would have to reckon with citizens who had learned that sovereignty, like gunpowder, could be taken and used. After the Bastille falls, Paris is armed and the court is shaken. But beyond the city lies a kingdom of fields and market towns where fear travels faster than news. Between the last 10 days of July and the first weeks of August 1789, rumor ripples across provinces. Bands of brigands are coming, foreign mercenaries are marching, harvests will be seized. The gains in Paris will be crushed. Church bells ring the tocsin, villagers muster, and in 1,000 places the old order meets a fiery audit. Historians call this wave the Great Fear, La Grande Peur. It is not a single march or plot, it is a cascade of local panics, each feeding the next. Messengers gallop from village to village, watchers scan horizons for dust clouds, any unfamiliar troop movement or convoy becomes a threat. In the Beauce and Brie near Paris, in Burgundy and the Nivernais, in the Franche-Comté and the Maconais, in parts of Alsace, Dauphiné and the Auvergne, the pattern repeats: alarm, assembly. And action. Action in many places means turning to the nearest symbols of seigneurial power. Crowds surround chateaux not primarily to seize treasure or murder lords, but to force open archives. They demand the terriers, the bundles of parchments listing dues, rents, obligations, hunting rights, and banalities owed to the local seigneur. When the documents are produced, they are piled in courtyards and burned. Flames consume inked claims to labor, money, and obedience. In some districts, the violence remains focused on paper. Elsewhere, buildings are sacked. Occasionally, there are assaults and deaths. But the most common image is fire under a summer sky and villagers reading before they light the match. To understand why a rent roll could provoke a riot, recall what those papers meant. They encoded the banalités, fees to use the lord's mill, oven, or winepress, the corvée-like labor still demanded in some regions. Exclusive hunting rights that let game trample peasant fields while peasants were forbidden to kill it, the seigneurial courts that adjudicated local disputes, and above all, a network of dues that felt increasingly detached from their original protective purpose. For peasants already bruised by high bread prices in 1788-89, these dues looked less like tradition and more like predation sanctified by parchment. Yet the great fear is not only rural. In towns, a municipal revolution accelerates. Citizens, committees claim authority, new communes are proclaimed, national guards are raised and swear to keep order in the name of the nation. Tricolor cockades bloom, the line between keeping order and remaking it blurs. When panic arrives at a town gate, the newly formed guards, half police, half political assembly, must decide, negotiate with the countryside, confront it, or join it. The choice varies town by town. Not all France burns. Some regions see little more than patrols and oaths, others experience prolonged unrest. Alsace reveals a special tension. In certain seigneuries, vestiges of personal servitude and tithes are still keenly felt. And the mix of languages and legal traditions sharpens disputes over what exactly is feudal and what is merely a contract. In Brittany and the Southwest, long-standing provincial privileges complicate loyalties. Are people defending local liberties against Paris or national rights against local lords? The Great Fear is a national event precisely because it takes so many local forms. The National Assembly at Versailles watches the countryside with alarm. Deputies are not blind to peasant grievances. Many are lawyers and landholders who have read the same cahiers de doléances calling for fairer dues and equal taxation, but they fear anarchy will devour. The Revolution. Reports of fires and forced renunciations arrive daily. Some deputies warn, if we do not abolish abuses by law, people will abolish them by fire. The tipping point comes in an extraordinary night session. On 4 August 1789, the Assembly opens debate on calming the countryside. What follows becomes known as the Night of 4 August. One by one, deputies, nobles, clerics, and commoners stand to renounce privileges, seigneurial courts, and exclusive hunting rights. Personal servitudes, the tithe that supports the church, exemptions from taxation attached to orders, provinces, towns, and offices. Even the purchase of high offices and the sale of military commissions come under moral scrutiny, though not all are ended that night. The mood is part theater, part repentance, part calculation, and wholly consequential. By dawn, the Assembly has voted a raft of principles that, taken together, promise to dismantle the legal architecture of the old regime. Clarity comes in the text that follows. Between 5 and 11 August, committees refine, and the Assembly votes the decrees of 4-11 August 1789. The headlines are plain to later generations, but worth stating carefully. First, personal servitudes and feudal rights of a personal nature are abolished immediately, without indemnity. Second, seigneurial dues of a real or contractual nature, those tied to land, are declared redeemable. Peasants can free themselves by paying an indemnity calculated from the dues value, a formula that will prove contentious and, in practice, unworkable until later legislation and the upheavals of 1792-93 sweep much of it away. Third, the tithe is abolished. The church will no longer collect a tenth from harvests, an enormous change that solves one grievance while creating a new problem of how to fund clergy and poor relief. Fourth, exclusive hunting rights end. The crop belongs to those who grow it, not to the Lord's deer. Fifth, all orders and corporations lose tax exemptions. Taxation is to be borne equally. Sixth, provincial privileges, special rights of places like Brittany, Burgundy, and others, are eliminated to create a more uniform nation under common law. These decrees do not instantly quiet every village. News is slow, trust is fragile, and the compensation scheme for redeemable dues disappoints many. But the political signal is unmistakable. The Assembly has chosen sides. It will not preserve the seigneurial order and merely adjust its rates. It will erase its legal superiority. Even where payment remains attached to land for a time, the principle has flipped. What was a mark of subordination becomes a contract destined for extinction. The church's position changes overnight. Without tithes, its traditional revenue base vanishes. For centuries, the tithe funded parish priests, bishops, households, charities, and education. The Assembly's later solution, placing church lands at the disposition of the nation, late 1789, and reorganizing the church under civil authority, 1790, lies ahead in our story. For now, understand the August decision as a necessary combative for the countryside that also pulls one of the old order's central pillars from the wall. The abolition of exclusive rights reaches down to daily life. A peasant may now kill game eating his grain without risking prosecution for violating a lord's chase. A village may grind corn where it chooses, bake bread in ovens it builds, press grapes without monopoly fees. These acts seem small in a constitution. They feel large in a kitchen. When critics later accuse the revolution of abstraction, they forget how August put concrete tools back into common hands. The decrees also strike sideways at the parliaments and provincial estates, not by name that night, but by logic. If law now flows from a national assembly representing citizens equally, then courts that claim to register and withhold edicts as guardians of fundamental laws lose their old leverage. If provinces no longer keep separate tax privileges, the nation replaces a patchwork of bargains with a public standard. Centralization is not yet complete, but the dismantling of corporate privilege has begun. Did the Great Fear cause the August decrees, or did both flow from the same pressures? Causation here is a braid. Without the countryside's fires, noble renunciations might have come slower and narrower, without months of argument about rights and representation. The Assembly might have responded with repression instead of reform. The night of 4 August is thus both a response to crisis and a fulfillment of ideas, a moment when self-interest, fear, and principle converge to right law. What about violence? It is important, especially for a channel committed to careful history, not to romanticize the weeks of panic. Some shaydocks were destroyed entirely. Some lords, stewards, and tax officials were beaten or killed. Minorities in certain areas faced threats. Yet it is equally important not to project later terrors backward. The Great Fear's signature is the burning of archives more than the slaughter of persons, the political redefinition of obligation more than indiscriminate destruction. In many places, villagers exacted oaths from their seigneurs rather than their blood. By late August, the Assembly couples its institutional hammer with a statement of principles. On 26 August 1789, it adopts the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a charter announcing liberty, equality before the law, national sovereignty, due process, and protections for property and free expression. Read together with the August decrees, the message is coherent. Privileges fall, rights rise, authority answers to the nation. The old regime's framework is not patched, it is replaced. And yet bread remains dear, pay uncertain, and rumor quick to spark. Paris, restless since Necker's dismissal in the Bastille, watches troop movements and court intrigues with suspicion. In October, the capital will march, the king will travel to Paris, the revolution will migrate from Versailles to the city, but that belongs to our next chapter. Here at summer's end stand two realities, a countryside that has tested its power and an assembly that has reimagined the law. If you seek the hinge where France's social order truly swings, look not only at the fall of a fortress in July, but at the fall of parchments in August. The Great Fear forced hidden structures into the open and made them flammable. The night of 4 August and the decrees of 4-11 August put out one fire by lighting another, the fire of equal law. From that night, subject gives way to citizen, and dues owed to a person begin to yield to duties owed to a nation. The old order has not merely been frightened, it has been fundamentally unmade. In the hot weeks after the Great Fear and the dramatic night of 4 August, the National Assembly set itself a second, quieter revolution, to say, in clear language, what it believed a free political order must protect. Not a law code, not a budget, a declaration. Between 20 and 26 August 1789, deputies debated, amended, and finally adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 17 articles that would become the revolution's moral compass and, in time, a constitutional fixture in France. The declaration did not appear out of thin air. Deputies worked from multiple drafts and traditions. The Marquis de Lafayette circulated a proposal early in July, shaped in conversation with Thomas Jefferson. Drawing on the Virginia Declaration of Rights, June 1776, and the broader Anglo-American language of natural rights. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, whose pamphlet What is the Third Estate had reframed sovereignty, submitted his own text emphasizing the nation as the source of all power. Jean-Joseph Mounier, a key figure in the Constitutional Committee, pushed for a concise, principled statement to precede any constitution. Through August, these streams merged in debate on the assembly floor, article by article. The preamble set the tone. Representatives of the French people assembled to establish the natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man, published these rights so that every public act can be measured against them, and so that citizens, reminded of their duties, may compare governors' deeds with first principles. In a country long ruled by custom, privilege, and royal edict, the assembly now asked to be judged by universal standards visible to all. Article 1 struck like a bell. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The sentence is both promise and provocation. It rejects any legal hierarchy among orders as such. Nobility confers no special civil rights. Equality here is juridical. The law must treat persons as equal bearers of rights. What counts as a right and how to secure it will occupy the assembly for years, but the premise is fixed. Inequality must be argued, not presumed. Article 2 named the rights the new order exists to protect: liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The list balances personal autonomy with safeguards and a final resort against abuse. Security answers the old regime's arbitrary imprisonments. Resistance to oppression grants a moral horizon beyond ordinary law. The sequence matters. Liberty is not license. It is bounded by the same law that keeps all safe. Article 3 lodged sovereignty, where the revolution had been moving since June. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body and no individual may exercise authority that does not expressly emanate from it. This does not yet abolish monarchy, it subordinates it. A king may reign, but only under conditions the nation authorizes. Article 4 defined liberty in a lawyer's sentence. One's freedom consists in doing anything that does not harm another. The limits of liberty are those that ensure others enjoy the same rights. And only law can mark those limits. This is the Enlightenment in legal prose, freedom bounded by reciprocal rights, with law as the neutral line. Article 5 completed the pair. The law may forbid only actions harmful to society. What is not forbidden cannot be punished. In a world where regulation had often flowed from privilege and custom, here was a clean, general principle: no secret crimes and no offenses invented after the fact. Article 6 turned back to representation. Law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to participate in its formation, personally or through representatives, and the law must be the same for all. Whether it protects or punishes. Offices and dignities are open to all according to virtues and talents, not birth. This article braided three transformations, from estate to citizen, from privilege to equal access, and from command to representation. Articles 7 through 9 built a due process shield. No one may be accused, arrested, or detained except in cases determined by law and according to lawful procedures. Arbitrary orders, letters de cachet, are excluded. Those who execute or demand illegal orders may be punished. Those who request lawful orders must be obeyed. The presumption of innocence is affirmed until guilt is declared. Penalties must be strictly and clearly necessary. French jurisprudence had long mixed overlapping jurisdictions with discretionary power. These articles pulled criminal justice toward clarity and restraint. Article 10 protected freedom of opinion, including religious belief, so long as its manifestation does not disturb public order as defined by law. Article 11 protected the free communication of thoughts and opinions, calling it one of the most precious rights of man, while allowing responsibility for abuses defined by law. In a Paris that had just discovered the power of pamphlets and newspapers, the Assembly recognized speech as the engine of citizenship, even as it reserved the right to police defamation or incitement. Articles 12 through 15 turned to force and finance. A public force is necessary to guarantee rights, but it exists for the advantage of all, not the private benefit of those who command it. Article 12. A common contribution, taxation, is essential and should be equally distributed among citizens according to their means. Article 13. Citizens have the right to decide, either personally or through representatives, the necessity of the tax, to consent to it, to monitor its use, and to determine its assessment and duration. Article 14. Article 15 closed the loop. Society has the right to require of every public agent an account of his administration. From garrison to treasury, the state is placed under public scrutiny. Article 16 drew a constitutional line in the sand. Any society in which the guarantee of rights is not assured, nor the separation of powers determined, has no constitution. This was a warning to the future drafters and a promise to the public that parchment alone would not suffice. Institutions must be arranged, so no single authority can swallow rights in a moment of passion or fear. Article 17 ended where many property-owning deputies began. Property is inviolable and sacred. No one may be deprived of it except when public necessity, legally established, clearly demands it, then only with just and prior compensation. In the wake of Augustus' abolition of feudal dues and tithes, this article assured owners and creditors that a regime of rights would not dissolve the security of holdings overnight, even as it allowed expropriation for public need. The adopted text was deliberately spare, principles, not policy, and it left important questions open. Who counted as a citizen for voting and office? In 1789-1791, the Assembly would distinguish active from passive citizens based on tax contribution, a limitation later attacked by radicals and erased in subsequent constitutions. What about slavery in the colonies? The Declaration's universal language did not immediately free enslaved people. Abolition in the French colonies would come, briefly, in 1794, after civil war and revolution in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, then be reversed under Napoleon, and finally re-established in 1848. What about women's? The text spoke of man and did not grant women political rights. In 1791, Olympe de Gouges would answer with her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, mirroring the articles to expose the gap between universal words and male citizenship. Nor did the Declaration settle the place of the Church. Article 10 protected religious opinion, and August had already abolished the tithes. Later measures, the nationalization of church lands, late 1789, and the civil constitution of the clergy, 1790, would redefine the church's legal status and ignite deep conflicts of conscience and loyalty. The Declaration offered the principle, freedom of conscience and a state answerable to citizens. The details would prove wrenching, yet the Declaration's endurance is unmistakable. It prefaced the Constitution of 1791. New versions appeared in the Jacobin Constitution of 1793 and the Thermidorian Constitution of 1795, and crucially, the 1789 text returned to France's constitutional bloc in the 20th century. The preamble of the 1946 Constitution and the 1958 Constitution of the Fifth Republic both reference 1789, and the Constitutional Council cites its articles to this day when reviewing laws. Beyond France, echoes are audible in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose opening claims about dignity, liberty, and equality carry the same cadence. To see how the Declaration changed daily life, picture a few simple scenes. A judge considers an arrest warrant. Without a law and due procedure, he refuses. A pamphleteer prints a biting critique of a minister. He may be liable for slander if he lies, but not for criticizing policy. A taxpayer reads a notice. The levy was voted by representatives and must be publicized. Its use can be audited. A young artisan imagines advancement. Offices are open according to talent, not birth. These scenes do not require perfection to show transformation. The Declaration also gave reformers in later crises a touchstone. During the Terror, opponents of emergency tribunals would appeal to Article 8's limits on penalties and Article 9's presumption of innocence, under the Directory. Critics of corruption would cite Article 15's demand for accountability in the 20th century as the state expanded. Jurists would return to Articles 2 and 4 to protect personal freedoms against administrative overreach. Principles traveled, sometimes ignored, sometimes narrowed, often revived. If the August decrees of 1789 tore down the scaffolding of privilege, the Declaration of the Rights of Man raised a frame for a new building. It did not finish the house, it set the measurements. Born and remain free and equal, sovereignty resides in the nation. Law is the general will, separation of powers, accountability. These were not abstractions to recite once and shelve. They were standards to measure new institutions, to restrain force, and to instruct citizens in what they could rightfully demand. As we leave August 1789, remember the order of operations: fear in the countryside, abolition of feudal privileges, then a declaration to define what should never return. In the next chapter, the fragile compromise between king and nation will strain further: bread, politics, and rumor pulling Paris toward the October days. For now, a parchment of 17 articles lies on the Assembly's table, and for the first time in French history, government has promised, in writing, what it owes to the governed. After August 1789 and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, France experimented with a fragile balance: a king who swore to the law, and a nation discovering its voice. That balance held only if trust endured. Between 1789 and 1792, trust dissolved, by bread, by oaths, by flight, and by war, until monarchy gave way to a republic. The first fracture came with hunger and rumor. On 5-6 October 1789, thousands of market women and National Guardsmen marched from Paris to Versailles, driven by soaring bread prices and fear that the court resisted the Assembly's work. By dawn, the royal family was compelled to relocate to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. This was not yet revolution against the king. It was a demand that the monarch live under the nation's eyes. A year later, hope staged a pageant. On 14 July 1790, the Fête de la Fédération drew crowds to the Champ de Mars to celebrate unity. Deputies, National Guards, and the king himself swore oaths to the nation, the law, and the king. For a moment, constitutional monarchy seemed plausible, rights declared, privilege abolished, and a crown bound to rules. Then religion split the country. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy, July 1790, reorganized dioceses to match departments and required clergy to take a civic oath, implemented in early 1791. Many parish priests swore, many others, encouraged by Rome's condemnation, refused. France now had juring and refractory clergy. In villages where priests were shepherds as well as officials, the oath cut through families and friendships. The king himself, a devout Catholic, hesitated before measures that wounded conscience, fueling doubts about his commitment to the new order. At the same time, the Constitution took shape. The Constitution of 1791 established a single-chamber legislature, the Legislative Assembly, a suspensive royal veto, and equality before the law. It preserved the crown's executive role, but placed sovereignty in the nation and opened public office to talent rather than birth. Yet the same settlement limited political rights to active citizens who paid a threshold in direct taxes, leaving many men and all women without the vote. It was a compromise, principled but partial. Before the king swore to that constitution, confidence collapsed. On the night of 2021, June 1791, the royal family fled Paris in disguise, aiming for the loyal garrison at Montmédy, the flight to Varennes. Recognized en route, they were stopped and escorted back to Paris under a heavy, mournful silence. The assembly suspended the king's powers while it investigated. The message to ordinary people was stark. If the Constitution's guarantor tried to leave, could the settlement stand? The return from Varennes radicalized public opinion. On 17 July 1791, thousands gathered on the Champ de Mars to petition for the king's removal. The Paris municipality declared martial law. Lafayette led the National Guard to disperse the crowd. Shots were fired, civilians died. The event split the revolutionary camp. Constitutional monarchists, soon called Feuillants, defended order and the 1791 settlement. Republicans, increasingly organized around the Jacobin Club and allied societies, argued that a king who fled could not be the keystone of liberty. In September 1791, the king accepted the Constitution and formally resumed his role, but the political ground had shifted. The new Legislative Assembly convened in October 1791 with no returning deputies from the previous body, a self-denying ordinance designed to prevent careerism. Factions congealed around questions the Constitution had left open: how to deal with refractory priests, immigré nobles gathering abroad, and the threat of foreign intervention. The assembly tested the king's suspensive veto almost immediately. In late 1791, deputies passed severe laws against immigrés and non-juring clergy. Louis XVI vetoed them, citing conscience and prudence. Each veto was legal, and each felt to many like sabotage. Suspicion hardened into a political fact. A constitution that depended on cooperation now functioned as a dual fought with formalities. In April 1792, the Assembly declared war on Austria. Prussia soon joined. Early campaigns went badly. Desertions, distrust between officers and volunteer battalions, and panic at the front. War did not unite the nation. It inflamed every fracture, religious, social, and political. As prices rose and defeats mounted, Paris grew volatile. The revolution that had been legal and municipal was becoming military and existential. On 20 June 1792, a crowd invaded the Tuileries. They forced the royal family to endure hours of pressure, while the king donned a red Phrygian cap, the people's symbol, and drank to the nation's health. He did not concede his veto. The scene captured the moment's impossibility: a monarch legally empowered to block decrees, and a populace that believed survival required those decrees to pass. A foreign threat made matters explosive. On 25 July 1792, the Duke of Brunswick, commanding invading Prussian forces, issued a manifesto threatening Paris with exemplary vengeance if the royal family were harmed. Intended to deter, it enraged. To many, the manifesto confirmed what they already suspected: the crown's safety and foreign arms now marched together against the people's sovereignty. On 10 August 1792, Paris rose. Sections, local political assemblies, the Radical Commune, and National Guards from the provinces converged on the Tuileries. After hours of violence, the palace was overrun. Hundreds of the Swiss guards lay dead. The Legislative Assembly suspended the king and ordered new elections for a national convention by broader male suffrage. The monarchy was not yet abolished, but it was effectively ended in practice. Louis XVI and his family were imprisoned in the Temple. In early September 1792, as Prussian forces advanced and fear of treachery spiked, Parisian crowds attacked city prisons, killing hundreds of inmates in the September massacres. The killings were not ordered by the Assembly. They were the product of panic, rumor, and a belief that counter-revolutionaries would strike as the army retreated. The event horrified moderates and fixed, for Europe, an image of a revolution devouring law in the name of security. Elections nonetheless proceeded. The National Convention met on 21 September 1792. Its first major act was to abolish the monarchy and proclaim the Republic. The next day it dated official time from year I of the French Republic. The revolution had crossed a constitutional Rubicon. Sovereignty no longer needed a crowned symbol. It would speak through elected deputies alone. The convention now faced a brutal docket, war on multiple fronts, economic strain at home, a church divided, and the fate of the former king. From December 1792 to January 1793, Louis XVI, tried as Citizen Louis Capet, stood before the convention. 3 votes framed the outcome: on his guilt, affirmed; on appealing to the people by referendum, rejected; and on the penalty, the death sentence carried by a narrow margin without a stay. On 21 January 1793, Louis XVI was executed. The European war widened. Inside France, politics would grow harder, sharper, and more radical. How did monarchy give way to republic? Not through a single conspiracy or sudden gust of ideology, but through cumulative breaches of trust. The October days relocated the king under the city's gaze. The civil constitution of the clergy estranged consciences. Varennes shattered confidence. The Champ de Mars drew blood between former allies. The veto, legal yet provocative, made government feel blocked. War transformed suspicion into an emergency. The Brunswick Manifesto fused foreign threat with fears of treason. 10 August removed the crown's shield, and the September massacres proved that, without legitimacy, security could become violence. Each step narrowed the path for a constitutional monarchy until none remained. It is essential, for honest history, to avoid myth-making at both extremes. Louis XVI was not a cartoon tyrant plotting ceaselessly against his people. He was a conscientious, religious man, overwhelmed by forces he could neither embrace nor master. Committed to principles, faith, and kingship that clashed with the revolution's direction. Nor was the people a single will. Parisian crowds, provincial voters, peasant communities, and soldiers at the front often disagreed, sometimes fiercely. What unified the movement was not unanimity, but a growing conviction that sovereignty must be effective, and that, in crisis, a vetoed liberty is no liberty at all. The republic that emerged in late 1792 was not inevitable in 1789, but it became logical after 1792. Once the king's trust collapsed and war demanded decisive action, representation without a royal counterweight looked, to many, like the only path to survival. The coming years will test that logic with terrible force, terror, civil war, and continental conflict, but the principle will endure. The nation, through its elected bodies, claims the final word. As we close this chapter, keep 3 images. First, the king on the Champ de Mars in 1790, swearing to a future that seemed within reach. Second, the lantern-lit carriages of Varennes, trust outpacing the wheels and failing to catch up. Third, the convention's vote in September 1792, plain words on parchment, abolishing monarchy by decree. Between those images lies the revolution's central lesson about power. Authority that cannot keep faith with the people will be replaced by authority that promises to, whatever the cost. By the autumn of 1793, the French Republic was fighting for its life. Foreign armies pressed on several fronts. Royalist and Catholic uprisings raged in the Vendée. Large cities, Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, had revolted against Paris. Toulon had admitted the British fleet. Food was scarce, inflation savaged wages, and suspicion ran through the streets. In this emergency, the convention empowered a small wartime cabinet, the Committee of Public Safety, to coordinate defense, supply, diplomacy, and internal security. Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Arras known for incorruptible rigor, joined the committee on 27 July 1793. The terror did not begin with him alone, but under his ascendancy, it acquired its sharpest edge. The terror was not a single law or midnight decision. It was a tightening lattice of measures passed between March 1793 and summer 1794 to meet war, insurrection, and famine. The Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris opened in March 1793 to try crimes against the state. On 17 September 1793, the law of suspects broadened who could be arrested, those lacking certificates of civism, former nobles who could not demonstrate loyalty. Anyone denounced for actions or words hostile to liberty. On 29 September, the general maximum imposed price ceilings on bread, grain, and basic goods to curb speculation. The idea was stark: mobilized the economy and the courts as weapons of national survival. Military emergency fed political emergency. In the West, the Vendée saw pitched battles and brutal reprisals through 1793-1794, costing tens of thousands of lives. In the Southeast, Lyon defied Paris and was retaken. Severe punishments followed. In Toulon, Allied control ended only in December 1793 after a siege in which a young artillery officer, Napoleon Bonaparte, won notice by retaking the heights and forcing the harbor's evacuation. The Committee of Public Safety tied these fronts together, directing armies, rationing powder, and demanding discipline from generals. The Levée en masse, decreed on 23 August 1793, conscripted manpower and reorganized the nation for total war. Young men to the armies, married men to forge weapons and transport supplies. Women to sew tents and uniforms, children to turn lint, the old to stir courage. It was a national draft and a social program, asserting that in a republic, defense is everyone's business. With it came new volunteer battalions, stricter requisitions, and a language of collective duty that matched the Declaration's rights with obligations. Robespierre's political philosophy gave the emergency a vocabulary. In his speech on the principles of political morality, 5 February 1794, he argued that in a republic, virtue, public-spirited commitment to the common good, must guide power in crisis. Virtue needed terror, not as cruelty but as swift, inflexible justice against enemies of liberty. The formula was compelling and dangerous. It promised moral government while normalizing exceptional force. Dechristianization campaigns, driven largely by local radicals and the Hébertist press, closed churches, smashed shrines, and staged reason festivals in late 1793. Robespierre, though hostile to clerical power, opposed this desecrating zeal as politically reckless. He steered the convention toward a deistic alternative, the cult of the supreme being. On 8 June 1794, a nationwide festival culminated in Paris with Robespierre presiding, a symbolic replacement of Catholic ritual with civic religion. To admirers it elevated virtue, to enemies it looked like self-coronation. Inside the revolutionary camp, 2 challenges rose and fell. On the radical flank, Jacques Hébert and his allies demanded more executions, more price controls, and more pressure from the Paris Commune. On 24 March 1794, the Hébertists went to the guillotine. On the other flank, Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins urged clemency and a relaxation of emergency courts. On 5 April 1794, they too were executed. By removing both the far-left agitation and the indulgent opposition, Robespierre and his colleagues isolated themselves at the center of a narrowing circle. The guillotine, proposed in principle by the physician Joseph Ignace Guillotin as a humane, equal method of execution, engineered by Anton Louis and Tobias Schmidt, had been in use since April 1792. During the Terror, it became a daily presence in Paris and in provincial tribunals. Between spring 1793 and summer 1794, roughly 16,000 people were legally condemned and executed across France. Thousands more died in prison or by summary shootings during civil war, bringing the death toll into the tens of thousands. The majority of those executed were small tradespeople, laborers, peasants, and soldiers, ordinary men and women caught in the tightening definitions of enemy. Procedural safeguards eroded as fear rose. The Law of 22 Prairial, year II, 10 June 1794, remodeled the Revolutionary Tribunal. Defense counsel was curtailed, evidence rules loosened, and the court given only 2 verdicts, acquittal or death. Trials accelerated, acquittals fell. The measure was defended as wartime necessity after plots were alleged within the prisons. In practice, it centralized lethal discretion in the capital and terrified deputies who saw their own margin of safety disappear. War fortunes shifted even as the tribunal accelerated. On 26 June 1794, the French won the Battle of Fleurus, securing Belgium and easing the foreign threat to the northeast. Victories followed on other fronts. The invasion danger receded. The paradox sharpened. As external danger fell, internal executions quickened under Prairial. Many deputies asked quietly the question that would soon be shouted: if the Republic was winning, why was terror widening? Robespierre's personal position grew more precarious. He spoke less often in the convention through early summer, intermittently absent with illness. Then returned in July, denouncing unnamed conspirators, corrupting both the Committee of Public Safety and the Committee of General Security. He demanded purification before normality. The tactic, effective against Hebert and Danton, now alarmed the convention as a whole. If the enemy was in our midst, but unnamed, anyone could be next. The break came on 9 Thermidor, year II, 27 July 1794. Robespierre rose to speak. Hostile deputies shouted him down. Votes passed to arrest him and close allies, Saint-Just, Couthon, Lebas, and Robespierre's younger brother Augustin. The Paris Commune tried a rescue. Municipal guards seized the prisoners from the Luxembourg, and barricades went up. But troops loyal to the convention under Barras and others retook the Hôtel de Ville after midnight. Robespierre was found with a shattered jaw. Whether by suicide attempt or a gendarme's shot remains debated. On 10 Thermidor, 28 July 1794, he and 21 associates were executed. The next day, a second batch followed. The season of state terror ended with the fall of its most visible steward. What precisely was the terror? It was a convergence of civil war, foreign invasion, economic collapse, and a young republic's belief that survival required exceptional law. It was also a politics of suspicion that narrowed the definition of loyalty until it swallowed allies. Its instruments were committees, tribunals, representatives on mission, requisitions, and the maximum. Its face was the guillotine. Its rhetoric mingled virtue with force. It stabilized fronts and rationed bread. It also killed too widely, too quickly, and after Fleurus, without convincing necessity. Robespierre's responsibility must be judged with precision. He neither invented the terror nor controlled every lever. He did, however, defend the tribunal's expansion, justify severe measures as moral duty, and help destroy alternatives, Hebert's demagoguery and Danton's clemency, that might have checked the machine. His incorruptible reputation made him persuasive. His intolerance of what he saw as vice made him implacable. When the fear he harnessed turned inward, the convention removed him to save itself. After Thermidor, the convention dismantled the emergency. The law of Prairial was repealed. The revolutionary tribunal slowed. Jacobin clubs were shuttered. Suspects were released in large numbers. A white backlash in some regions, the White Terror, targeted former Jacobins and militants. Economically, the maximum was relaxed. Inflation and scarcity returned with a vengeance, provoking new unrest. Politically, the Directory would emerge in 1795 as a more conservative, fragile regime, still at war, still indebted, still dependent on generals. The Terror's legacy is double. On one side stand the victories of year II, the levy en masse, and the administrative coordination that prevented the Republic's collapse. On the other stand laws that crushed defense rights, normalized emergency justice, and taught that politics could be purified by blood. Later generations would invoke the terror both as warning and as precedent, some to justify harsh measures in crisis, others to insist that liberty, without legal limits, dissolves into fear. For our quiet reconstruction, the numbers and dates matter, but so does the arc. From September 1793's Law of Suspects to June 1794's Law of Prairial, from Toulon retaken in December 1793 to Fleurus I in June 1794. From the executions of Hebert and Danton in March-April to Robespierre's fall in July, the terror began as a shield and ended as a sword pointed inward. The revolution had promised rights and demanded virtue. The terror tried to guarantee virtue by law and found that law, unbounded, devours both. In the next chapter, the vacuum left by exhausted legislators and politicized crowds will be filled by men in uniform. The Republic will look for order on the battlefield and find an ambitious general ready to supply it. But before we march with him, remember the lesson of year II. A free nation must survive its enemies and also survive its defenders. Thermidor ended the terror in July 1794, but it did not end uncertainty. France still fought Europe, money lost value, and politics swung between street pressure and parliamentary intrigue. In 1795, a new constitution created the Directory, 5 executives atop a 2-chamber legislature, Council of 500 and Council of Ancients. The design aimed to prevent both royal restoration and Jacobin dictatorship. In practice, the regime survived by balancing fear, bayonets, and ballots, often in that order. Napoleon Bonaparte first entered national view as an artillery officer with a gift for turning moments. Born in Corsica in 1769, schooled in France, he rose quickly under the Republic. In December 1793 at Toulon, he helped drive out the British by seizing the heights that controlled the harbor. Promotion followed. His name next surfaced in Paris on 13 Vendémiaire year IV, 5 October 1795, when royalist crowds threatened the new legislature. General Bonaparte, given command, used grapeshot to clear the streets, bloody, decisive, and to the Directory, reassuring. Order mattered more than gentleness. The young general was noticed. The Directory needed victories to legitimize itself and money to pay soldiers. Italy promised both. In March 1796, Bonaparte took command of the army of Italy, hungry, undersupplied, and facing Austrian and Piedmontese forces. He moved fast. At Montenot and Millesimo, he split opponents. At Lodi, 10 May, he pushed cannon over a bridge under fire, then used that legend of audacity to rally the ranks and frighten rivals. Through 1796-1797, he beat Austrian armies repeatedly. Castiglione, August, Arkell, November, and Rivoli, January 1797. Each victory yielded contributions from conquered territories, supplies for the army, and leverage at the negotiating table. Diplomacy followed the guns. With Austria stretched and northern Italy remade into sister republics, France signed the Treaty of Campo Formio, 17 October 1797. Austria recognized French gains on the Rhine's left bank. Venice's old republic was dissolved, and new client states in Italy, like the Cisalpine Republic, extended French influence. The Directory basked in reflected glory, but it also felt a chill. The general in Italy negotiated boldly, controlled armies loyal to him, and sent home treasure and art. He was becoming a political fact. The next theater was Egypt. In 1798, to strike British interests indirectly and to project French power in the eastern Mediterranean, Bonaparte sailed with an army and a corps of scholars. Malta fell en route. On 21 July, he beat Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids outside Cairo. But on 1-2 August, Admiral Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile Aboukir Bay, stranding the army. The expedition was a strange mixture: administration and reform in Egypt, a scientific survey. The scholars' work would later unlock hieroglyphs via the Rosetta Stone. A failed Syrian campaign before the walls of Acre in 1799, and a land victory over Ottoman forces at Aboukir in July 1799 that could not compensate for maritime isolation. Meanwhile, the Directory frayed. In September 1797, 18 Fructidor, directors used troops to overturn elections and purge royalists. In 1798-1799, they lurched the other way to counter Jacobin agitation. War widened again. The Second Coalition formed Britain, Austria, Russia, others, and French armies suffered reverses in Germany and Italy. Inflation and requisitions bit at home. Uprisings flickered in the West. The Directory's survival tactics, electoral annulments, press restrictions, and dependence on generals made it look less like a republic of laws and more like a stopgap. Bonaparte read the weather. Leaving his army under capable deputies, he slipped back to France in October 1799. He arrived to a country tired of instability and elites searching for a steadier hand, one strong enough to command, but not so blatant as to call itself a king. Over salons and suppers, a plan formed: reorganize power under a new constitution. The key date followed swiftly: 1819 Brumaire year VII, 9-10 November 1799. The Brumaire coup unfolded in stages. Under pretext of a Jacobin plot, the councils were moved to St. Cloud. Troops loyal or obedient to Bonaparte surrounded the site. Inside, debate turned chaotic. When Bonaparte entered the council of 500, deputies shouted him down. His brother Lucian, presiding, declared the assembly threatened by extremists. Grenadiers cleared the hall. By night's end, the directors had resigned or been pushed aside, and provisional consuls, Bonaparte, Sieyès, and Roger Ducos, claimed executive authority. The revolution, exhausted, handed its future to a soldier and a jurist. Constitution followed force. The Constitution of year VII, December 1799, created the consulate. 3 consuls, with Bonaparte as first consul wielding real power. a slimmed and layered legislature, tribunate to discuss. Core legislative to vote, a conservative senate to guard the formula, and a council of state to draft laws. A plebiscite ratified the text, an instrument the new regime would use repeatedly to cloak authority in popular assent. The promise was stability, the price was concentration. Bonaparte's early domestic program balanced consolidation with reconciliation. In 1800, he created the Bank of France to stabilize currency and credit, appointed prefects to run departments with efficient central oversight, and launched lycées to train civil servants and officers in a standardized curriculum. Roads and canals saw renewed investment. Tax collection became more regular and less farmed out to private contractors. The message was clear: administration, not agitation. He also sought a truce with faith. The Concordat with Pope Pius VII, signed 1801, promulgated 1802, recognized Catholicism as the religion of the great majority of French citizens, without restoring it as a state church. Bishops would be nominated by the government and instituted by Rome, clergy would be paid by the state, and the church accepted the post-revolutionary sale of its former lands as irreversible. For believers, parish life normalized. For the state, a potential source of civil strife softened. Religious peace, yes, but under civil supremacy. Foreign war could not be ignored. In June 1800, Bonaparte crossed the Alps, the army mostly over the Great St. Bernard Pass, and won at Marengo, forcing Austria to terms. Hohenlinden, December 1800, completed the job in Germany. Peace of Lunéville, 1801, echoed and extended Campo Formio. With Britain, the Peace of Amiens, March 1802, paused hostilities. For the first time in a decade, Europe exhaled. At home, the regime used the calm to tighten its grip. Censorship increased. Political clubs stayed closed. A plebiscite in 1802 made Bonaparte consul for life. The Civil Code, promulgated March 1804, distilled years of revolutionary decrees and customary law into a unified set of private law rules. Equality before the law for men. Civil marriage and divorce, later restricted, property rights, and secular authority over civil status. It preserved core revolutionary principles: end of feudal privileges, careers open to talent, while entrenching paternal authority in the family and curbing workers' collective leverage, e.g. the livret ouvrier, a worker's passbook. Whatever one's judgment, the code outlived regimes and became France's legal backbone and an export across Europe. Napoleon's talent was to wrap settlement in momentum. He told elites that property and order were safe. He told soldiers that glory awaited. He told believers that their parishes were back. He told jurists that statutes would be clear. Many accepted the bargain because the alternative seemed to be the Directory's drift or the terror's fear. The price was political pluralism. Opposition found little space. The press narrowed. Plebiscites replaced robust deliberation. The revolution's promise of citizenship remained, but its practice grew choreographed. Was the revolution ended? It depends on the measure. The consulate and then the empire, proclaimed in 1804, did not restore feudal dues, noble tax exemptions, or the corporate privileges the August decrees had abolished. Equality before the law for men, secular civil status, merit-based offices, prefect-led administration, and national education endured. But the experiment in legislative primacy and a free political public sphere gave way to executive centralism and managed opinion. The nation kept its rights on paper, the government kept initiative in fact. Napoleon's rise thus closed one argument and opened another. He solved the revolutionary triad of crises: war, religion, and administration, by force, concordat, and code. He also reintroduced hierarchy in new forms: titles without feudal privileges, a court without an estate system, surveillance without parliaments. For many in 1802, the ledger showed net gain: bread, jobs, and law. For others, especially veterans of clubs and committees, it marked a retreat from the civic energy of 1789-1792. The story's hinge is 1799-1802, from Brumare's bayonets to Amiens' handshake, from prefects to the bank, from church settlement to schools. In those years, a republic born in debate accepted a consulate born in decision. When we next see Napoleon, it will be as emperor, crowned in 1804, an act that codifies what had already occurred, the revolution's ideals seated in a new throne of order. Whether that throne would carry France to durable peace or to new wars was the question the 19th century would answer. In 1789, France did not merely change a government, it changed the grammar of politics. A society built on orders and privilege declared that sovereignty rests in the nation, that citizens are equal before the law, and that power must be limited by written rules. The August Decrees 411 August 1789 ended feudal privileges in law. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen 26 August 1789 fixed universal principles: liberty, property, security. Due process, representation, that still anchor constitutions today. The revolution proved that ideas could become institutions. Departments replaced patchwork provinces, elected municipalities and national guards spread civic habits, juries and uniform procedures pulled justice toward common standards. Even when France lurched through crisis, war, civil conflict, and the terror, the expectation survived that authority must answer to public reason and written guarantees. That expectation outlived factions and regimes. Napoleon's ascent closed one chapter and opened another. The consulate and empire concentrated power, yet they preserved and exported core gains, careers open to talent, civil equality for men, the secular state's control of civil status. And the Napoleonic Civil Code, 1804, which standardized property, contracts, and family law across France and far beyond. Prefects lycées and the Bank of France gave administration, education, and finance durable shape. These were revolutionary outcomes in a post-revolutionary form. The French Revolution was never only French. Its laws and armies dismantled feudal structures across much of Europe. Its vocabulary, rights, nation, citizen, armed reformers, and frightened monarchs from Madrid to Warsaw. In the Caribbean, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue used the same language of liberty to fight for their own emancipation. Leading to Haiti's independence in 1804, the first Black Republic, and a decisive proof that the revolution's claims could travel further than Paris intended. The world's politics adjusted to this shock. The Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815, tried to restore balance, but it could not erase what had been learned, that public legitimacy requires more than dynasty, and that citizenship can mobilize nations on a scale unknown to the old regime. The 1830 and 1848 revolutions, the spread of constitutions, and much later. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights all bear the imprint of 1789's sentences written in ordinary ink and extraordinary time. The ledger is mixed and human. The revolution birthed rights and constitutions, and also emergencies that narrowed them. It proclaimed universal ideals while withholding them from many women, colonized peoples, who then demanded inclusion in the same terms. But its lasting force lies in a simple inversion. The state serves the citizen, not the other way around. Once spoken aloud, that claim proved hard to silence. If you trace one thread through our series, from bread queues and parish cahiers to the assembly's votes, the fall of a fortress, the abolition of dues, a monarch judged by law, and a code that outlived its author, it is this: modern democracy begins when ordinary people insist that law must be public, general, and answerable to them. France taught that lesson with struggle and cost. The world has been relearning and extending it ever since.